In this segment, we see a large mob of grazing cattle react to one handler entering the paddock, and the position the handler places himself to get the mob to move in the desired direction. As the handler approaches the cattle, they become aware of his presence, but they do not initially move. At this stage, the handler is a thing of curiosity rather than a threat. The cattle will face the handler, but he is still outside both the mob and the individual animal's flight zone. This is the area around the animal at which they will move away from the perceived threat. As the handler moves into the flight zone of the front animals, they turn to move away. This is the initial reaction the handler wants, to begin moving the mob. As he approaches further, the rest of the cattle begin to move away. The handler immediately rewards them by taking the pressure off as he moves to the other side of the mob. The cattle start moving as a mob in the direction they had turned to face. As the mob begins to move, the individuals at the back turn away from the handler and become part of the mob movement. In this small paddock, the cattle move along the fence, and the handler keeps out wide to the left to put just the right amount of pressure on the mob to control their speed. Flighty cattle with larger flight zones may require the handler to stay well away, but still within sight of the cattle. The handler zigzags back and forth, coming in to put pressure on the tail enders, which is then immediately released. As he moves out from the mob, he is sighted by the mob leaders. This in turn puts pressure on them to keep moving in the desired direction. These cattle are naturally turning towards the gate at the top of the paddock. The handler allows them to do so by taking pressure off the left-hand side of the leaders and coming in behind the mob. The handler rides slowly, his aim always to have the cattle walk and not run. With the aim to move the cattle out of the corner of the paddock, the handler keeps still and applies no further pressure. He is on the edge of the flight zone, and he waits as the leaders turn to move away. As movement starts, he can put a little more pressure on the back of the mob, but ceases his movement when he gets the right response. The cattle turning away from him and becoming part of the mob movement. When the mob starts to move, the handler can move as well. The handler now has a good feel for the flight zone of the mob and maintains his position out from the mob, again controlling the pace of movement by his position. His zigzag movement puts and releases pressure on the cattle and controls the speed. He steers the mob by applying this principle to the leaders out the front. Again, the handler needs to move the cattle out of the paddock corner. As he approaches, they turn to look at him. He patiently allows them to turn away and start moving in the direction he wants. A bit more pressure gets the desired movement, and he stops as soon as he gets the response he wants. The cattle now begin to move as a mob once more. The cattle have responded quickly to the way they are being handled, comfortable in their movement, aware of the handler and following the lead animal. The handler maintains his distance and continues to steer the mob by working the lead animals. He rides across the back of the mob, putting pressure on individuals and then releasing it as he moves in and then out of their flight zone. More pressure on this side of the mob steers the mob in the right direction. The mob is happy to walk rather than run, indicating that the handler has positioned himself well. Eventually the cattle would string out, with one individual following another in single file. This is always a good sign that they are comfortable in their movement.